The bread was gone again, and that was the moment I finally let myself admit that something in my house had changed without my permission. I stood in front of my own kitchen counter at 6 in the morning with the bread bag twisted shut and empty in my hand, and I felt my stomach do something it had not done in years. A kind of slow drop, the kind you feel when the porch step gives a little under your boot before it catches. I am a man who has spent his whole working life paying attention to small details, to the weight of a parcel, to the way a dog watches you from behind a fence before it decides whether to bark. And that morning, every instinct I had built over 40 years on a mail route was telling me the same thing. Somebody in this house was hungry in a way that did not match the woman I knew. My name is Harold Whitmore, and I am 72 years old, and for most of my life, I carried other people's letters up and down the hills of Burlington, Vermont, in every kind of weather this state can throw at a man, which is most kinds, and some that should not legally be allowed to exist. I retired 6 years ago with a pension, a bad knee, and a closet full of navy blue uniforms I never had the heart to give away. My wife Eleanor passed 4 years back, and since then, this old Victorian house in the South End has been quieter than I ever thought a house could be. The radiators still tick the same way they always did. The floors still creak in the same 3 places. But the silence in between those familiar sounds got loud in a way I did not expect, the kind of loud that makes a man talk to his coffee maker just to hear a voice that is not his own. So when my granddaughter Emily moved in this past autumn, I will tell you the truth, I cried a little in the bathroom where nobody could see me, because for the first time since Eleanor died, the house had a reason to smell like something other than my own cooking. Emily is 27 years old, an elementary school librarian over at one of the schools near the new North End, and she had been living in her grandmother's old farmhouse out past Shelburne Road, the one that had been left to her, but the place needed a new roof and new wiring and about a dozen other things before winter, and so she came to stay with me while the work got done. I told her she could stay as long as she liked. I meant it. I still mean it. For the first few weeks, everything felt like a gift I had not earned. Emily would come down in the mornings with her hair still damp from the shower, and she would sit across from me at the same table where Eleanor and I raised her mother, and we would talk about nothing important. The weather coming off Lake Champlain, a book she was reading, a student who had said something funny about dinosaurs. It felt like the house had its heartbeat back. But somewhere in the middle of November, I started noticing things. Small things. The kind of things a man only notices if he has spent a lifetime paying attention to small things for a living. Let me stop right here for just a second, because I am not a man who is used to talking like this out loud to people I cannot see. So if you're still with me, do me a favor. Tell me down in the comments where you're listening from, what town, what state, and if it is late where you are, tell me that too. It helps me to know I'm not sitting alone in the dark with all of this. Leave a like if what I am saying is landing on you, and subscribe if you want to hear the rest of it, because there is more to this than bread going missing. And I promise you, it is worth staying for. All right, let me get back to it. The first thing I noticed was the soup. I keep a shelf in the pantry, stocked the way Eleanor always kept it, cans lined up like soldiers, tomato and chicken, and that split pea she used to make me eat, even though I complained about it every single time. I do not eat a great deal of canned soup these days. My doctor has opinions about sodium that I mostly ignore, but I like having it there, the way some men like having a full gas tank even when they are not planning a trip. One Tuesday I went looking for a can of chicken noodle because the weather had turned cold enough to make my knee complain, and I found the shelf thinner than I remembered. Not empty, just thinner. I told myself I was misremembering. A man my age starts to distrust his own memory about small things, mostly because so many people seem eager to tell him he should. Then it was the crackers. I had bought 2 sleeves of saltines at the market on a Friday, and by the following Wednesday, one sleeve had vanished entirely, wrapper and all, with no crumbs left behind, no evidence in the trash, nothing. I'm not a man who counts crackers. I want to be clear about that. But I am a man who notices patterns, because 39 years of sorting mail will do that to you whether you like it or not. And patterns were starting to form in my kitchen that did not add up to anything I could explain. I want you to understand something about my granddaughter before I go any further, because it matters for everything that comes after. Emily was always the kind of child who noticed things other people walked right past. When she was small, maybe 7 or 8 years old, she used to save half her sandwich at school, not because she did not like it, but because there was a boy in her class whose lunch was thin some days, and she would slide half of hers across the table like it was nothing at all, like she had simply made too much. Her mother told me about it years later, almost as an aside. The way you mention something that seems small until you realize it was not small at all. Emily grew into a woman who tips generously even when money is tight, who remembers the names of people most folks forget to ask, who once drove 40 minutes in a snowstorm to bring a casserole to a coworker she barely knew because she heard the woman's husband was in the hospital. That is who Emily Whitmore is. She gives. She's always given. What I did not understand yet, sitting at my kitchen table with a half-empty cracker box in my hand, was how much, and to whom, and at what cost to herself. I started watching more closely after that, the way I used to watch a porch for a dog I did not trust yet. I noticed that Emily had taken to skipping breakfast some mornings, telling me she had eaten already, though I never once saw a dish in the sink to prove it. I noticed she would make herself a plate at dinner and move the food around more than she ate it. And when I asked if something was wrong with the cooking, she would smile that same warm smile her mother has and tell me it was wonderful. She was just not very hungry tonight. I noticed that when I suggested we go out to the diner on Church Street for a Friday supper the way Eleanor and I used to, Emily would find a polite reason to decline, and then insist on paying for mine when we did go, sliding her card across the counter before I could even reach for my wallet, like she was racing me to it. None of these things, taken on their own, would have meant much. A young woman watching her budget. A young woman with a lot on her plate at work, no pun intended. A young woman who simply does not eat like her grandfather does. 3 solid meals and a coffee strong enough to strip paint. I told myself these stories because they were easier to live with than the alternative, which was the slow, cold feeling building in my chest that something was wrong, and that my granddaughter, who I loved more than I had words for, was hiding it from me on purpose. There's a particular kind of helplessness that comes with being an old man who notices too much and understands too little. I had spent decades reading the small signals on people's porches, the unswept steps that meant trouble inside, the curtains drawn at strange hours, the way a dog's bark changes when something in a house has shifted. But Emily was not a stranger's porch. She was my own blood, sitting 3 feet away from me at supper, and I could not read her the way I read the world outside my truck window for all those years. That frightened me more than I wanted to admit, even to myself. Even alone in the quiet of my own bedroom at night with Eleanor's side of the bed, still made the same way it had been for 4 years. I remember the time, years back now, when Eleanor first got sick and tried to hide how bad the headaches had gotten, because she did not want to worry me during a particularly hard winter on the route. I had noticed the same kind of small inconsistencies then, the aspirin bottle emptying faster than it should, the way she would wince and then smooth her face over the second she felt my eyes on her. I did not catch it in time to make much difference in how things played out, and that failure has lived in me ever since, quiet most days, but never gone. So when I started seeing those same kinds of small, careful inconsistencies in Emily, something old and frightened woke up inside me that I thought I had buried with my wife. I want to pause again here for a moment, because I think some of you listening know exactly what I'm talking about. Have you ever loved somebody so much that you started reading the smallest details of their life, like a man reads weather coming in off the lake, trying to figure out if a storm is coming before anybody else can see the clouds? If that is you, tell me about it in the comments. Tell me where you are tonight and what time your clock says, because I'm curious how many of us are sitting up thinking about somebody we love instead of sleeping. And if this story is doing something for you, hit that subscribe button, because there is a new one of these waiting for you tomorrow, and I've got a feeling tomorrow's might be the one that hits somebody exactly where they need it. Now, where was I? The snowstorm came on a Thursday in early December, one of those Vermont storms that does not announce itself politely, it just arrives. The kind that piles up against the north side of the house and makes the whole structure groan like an old man getting out of a chair. I could not sleep that night. My knee was complaining about the pressure change, the way it always does before a big snow, an old man's barometer built right into the joint, free of charge and entirely unwanted. I got up around 1:30 in the morning to make myself a cup of decaffeinated tea, the kind Eleanor always teased me for drinking, calling it tea-flavored water. And on my way back down the hall to my own room, I noticed something. There was a thin line of light beneath Emily's bedroom door. Now, a light under a door at 1:30 in the morning is not by itself a strange thing. People read at odd hours. People have trouble sleeping. I have had plenty of nights myself where the only company I kept was the lamp on my nightstand and a book I was not really reading. But something about the quality of that light and the small sounds I heard beneath it, a soft rustle, the careful, deliberate shifting of something being moved and arranged, made the hair stand up on the back of my neck the way it used to when I was walking up to a porch on my route, and the dog had gone unnaturally quiet instead of barking. I stood there in the hallway longer than I am proud to admit, an old man in his socks at 1:30 in the morning, listening at his own granddaughter's door like he had no manners at all, but I could not make myself walk away. After a few minutes, the light went out. I heard the soft creak of a mattress taking weight, and I went back to my own room and lay there until the gray Vermont morning finally arrived, with absolutely no intention of letting this go. The next morning, Emily left for the school early, the way she always did on snow days, since the roads needed extra time and the buses ran behind schedule. I stood at the kitchen window and watched her car pull carefully out of the driveway, the wipers working hard against snow that had not yet decided to stop falling, and once her taillights disappeared around the corner onto our street, I stood there for a long while with my hand still resting on the cold window glass. I'm not a man who goes through other people's rooms. I want that understood clearly. I raised my own daughter to believe in privacy, and I believed in it myself long before that. since a man who reads other people's mail for a living learns very quickly the sacredness of what belongs to somebody else and nobody else. But there comes a point where love and worry override even the rules a man has held his whole life. And that morning, standing in my own quiet kitchen with the snow still falling outside, I made a decision I have turned over in my mind every day since, asking myself if it was the right one. I still believe it was. I will let you decide for yourself by the end of this. I walked up the stairs slower than I needed to, the way a man walks when part of him is hoping he will run out of time before he has to follow through on something. I knocked on Emily's closed door, foolishly, even though I knew the house was empty, the way you might knock before walking into a room you already know is vacant, just to give your own conscience one last chance to stop you. Nobody answered, of course. I turned the knob and stepped inside. Emily's room smelled the way it always did, like the lavender lotion she has used since she was a teenager, and like the wood polish I use on the old furniture throughout the house. The bed was made with military precision, a habit she picked up, ironically, from me, since I spent decades making a bed the same exact way every single morning before a root. Her desk was neat, her closet door was shut. Nothing about the room looked disturbed or strange in any obvious way. For one brief, relieved moment, I thought perhaps I had imagined the whole thing, that an old man's mind had simply wandered too far into worry during a long, sleepless, snowbound night. Then I noticed the corner of fabric peeking out from beneath the bedskirt, just barely, the kind of small detail a man only catches if he has spent decades trained to notice the smallest inconsistency in an otherwise ordinary scene. I knelt down, my knee complaining the whole way, and I lifted the edge of the bedskirt. And what I found there stopped my breath in my chest, the way nothing had, since the morning the doctor told me about Eleanor. It was one of those heavy canvas grocery bags, the reusable kind with handles worn soft from use, and it was packed full, organized with a precision that nearly broke my heart on sight. Cans of soup, stacked label out, the same kind that had been disappearing from my own pantry shelf, boxes of dried pasta, a canister of oatmeal, several bottles of water lined up like good soldiers, tea bags and a small plastic bag of their own, sealed carefully against moisture, and taped to the inside of the canvas bag, a small index card in Emily's careful, looping handwriting, listing items and dates, expiration dates, written out with the same quiet diligence she'd probably used cataloging books at her library, organized not like the secret stash of a desperate young woman hoarding food for herself, but like an inventory somebody intended to use for something, or somebody beyond her own four walls. I sat back on my heels in that quiet room with the snow still falling outside the window, holding that bag of carefully organized food in my two hands, and for the life of me, I could not understand what I was looking at. I knew only one thing for certain in that moment. Something was happening underneath my own roof that I had completely failed to see, and whatever it was, it had nothing to do with theft, and nothing to do with carelessness, and everything to do with a kind of quiet, careful love that I did not yet have the eyes to recognize for what it was. I want to stop here for a moment, because my chest still gets tight thinking about that morning, kneeling on my granddaughter's bedroom floor like a man who had stumbled onto something sacred without permission. If you are still with me, tell me where you are listening from tonight, and what time it is there, because some of you might be sitting up the same way I once was, wondering about somebody you love. Leave that, like if this story has got its hand around your heart the way it has mine telling it. Subscribe if you have not already, because there is more here than I have told you yet. And I promise you the truth is not what either one of us expects right now. There is a new story like this one every single day, and I have got a feeling some of you out there need to hear where this one goes. Now, let me take you back to that snowbound morning, kneeling on the floor with that bag in my hands, because that was only the beginning of what I would come to understand. I put the bag back exactly where I had found it, smoothing the bed skirt down with hands that were not quite steady, and I went downstairs and sat at my kitchen table for a long while without moving, the way a man sits after he has been told news he does not yet know how to carry. The snow kept falling outside the window, soft and steady, the kind of snow that makes the whole world go quiet. And I sat there in that quiet, trying to make sense of canned soup and oatmeal and careful handwriting. And I could not yet, not with the pieces I had. What I did know, sitting there at that table built by my own father's hands, 2 generations before mine, was that my granddaughter was carrying something heavy, something she had decided to carry alone, without telling a single soul, without telling me, and that whatever it was, it had been going on for longer than I had noticed, hidden in plain sight beneath my own roof, in a house I thought I knew every corner of after 72 years of living. And I knew one more thing, with a certainty that settled into my bones the way cold settles into an old man's joints before a storm. I was not going to let this go. Whatever Emily was hiding, whatever weight she had decided to shoulder by herself in the dark of a snowbound December night, I intended to find out, gently, carefully, and with every ounce of patience a postal carrier learns over 40 years of knocking on doors that do not always want to open. I want to tell you something about the week that followed, because it taught me more about my own granddaughter and, frankly, about myself than nearly any other week of my life. And I have had 72 years of weeks to compare it against. After finding that bag beneath her bed, I did not say a single word to Emily about it. Not because I was avoiding her, but because something in my gut, some old instinct built over decades of reading porches and faces and the careful way people hold themselves when they are protecting something fragile, told me that confronting her directly before I understood what I was looking at would only push the truth further out of reach. So instead, I watched, quietly, carefully, the way I used to watch a root for trouble before trouble ever announced itself. The first thing I noticed, now that my eyes had been open to look for it, was how Emily handled money. I had always known her to be careful with a dollar, the way most young people are these days with the cost of everything climbing the way it has. But careful is one thing, and what I began to see was something else entirely. She would stand in the cereal aisle at the market on Pine Street with her phone out, comparing prices between two nearly identical brands for a full 2 minutes before choosing. And yet, that same week, I watched her slide an extra $20 into the donation jar at the register without a second of hesitation, the kind of jar most folks walk past without even noticing it exists. She would skip buying herself a coffee from the shop near the school, the same shop she used to visit every single morning according to her receipts. I noticed piling up in the recycling, and yet she never once forgot a single neighbor's birthday, always showing up with a small, thoughtful gift that cost more than she seemed willing to spend on herself in a month. Let me pause here for just a moment, because I promised myself I would keep checking in with you as we go. Tell me down in the comments where you are listening from tonight, what town, what corner of this country, and what the clock says where you are sitting right now. If you have ever watched somebody you love give and give while quietly going without themselves, leave that like, because I think a lot of us know exactly what that looks like. Subscribe if you have not yet, because tomorrow there is another story waiting, and I've got a feeling it might land on somebody who needs it just as much as this one is landing on you tonight. All right? Let me keep going, because it gets harder to understand before it gets easier. There was a Sunday that week when my daughter, Emily's mother Patricia, came by the house with her husband for our usual family supper, a tradition Eleanor started decades ago that none of us have had the heart to let die even after she passed. I made a pot roast, the same recipe Eleanor used to make, the one with the carrots cooked down soft and the gravy thickened just right, and the whole house smelled the way it used to smell on Sunday afternoons when our daughter was still a girl running through these same halls. Emily sat at the table, and I watched her more closely than I let on, the way a man watches a hand of cards he is trying not to give away that he is studying. She ate perhaps a third of what was on her plate. She laughed at her stepfather's terrible jokes, the same ones he has been telling for 15 years that somehow still land with this family. She asked her mother thoughtful questions about an upcoming work trip. She was, by every outward measure, the same warm, present, attentive young woman she has always been. But when the bill came up in conversation, because Patricia mentioned the rising cost of heating oil this winter, the way it has hit every household in this state harder than most years, I watched something flicker across Emily's face, there and gone so fast that I might have missed it if I had not spent 40 years learning to read faces on porches in every kind of weather. It was not fear, exactly. It was something closer to recognition. Like she knew something about that rising cost that the rest of us at that table did not. After supper, while Patricia and her husband were getting their coats on by the front door, I followed Emily into the kitchen on the excuse of helping with dishes. Though we both know I have never once dried a dish properly in my life, a fact Eleanor used to tease me about constantly. I worked up the nerve, standing there with a dish towel in my hands like a man holding a tool he does not know how to use, and I asked her gently if everything was all right. Not a direct question about the bag, not yet. I was not ready for that. But a door left open, the kind a man leaves open when he wants someone to walk through it on their own terms, rather than be dragged through it. She told me everything was fine, Grandpa. Just busy at work, the usual, and she smiled at me the exact same smile her mother gives when she is hiding a worry of her own. A smile I had seen on 3 generations of women in this family now, going all the way back to Eleanor. A smile that says, I love you too much to burden you with this. I let it go that night. But I went to bed with the same cold worry sitting in my chest that had been there since the snowstorm, and I made myself a promise, lying there in the dark, that I would find a gentler way in than a direct question Emily was clearly prepared to deflect. The opportunity came nearly accidentally, the way the most important things in life often seem to. I have always done a portion of my own grocery shopping at a smaller market over near the south end, rather than the big chain stores. Partly out of habit, since I have shopped there since before Emily's mother was born, and partly because the owner, a woman named Carol, who has run that store with her late husband and now alone for going on 30 years, has become something close to a friend over the decades. Carol knows everybody in that neighborhood, the way certain shopkeepers in small communities always do, keeping track of who is struggling and who is thriving with a kind of quiet, unspoken record keeping that never shows up on any official document anywhere. I stopped in on a Wednesday afternoon for a few things: coffee, a loaf of bread, the ordinary errands of an old man's week. And while Carol was ringing me up, she mentioned, almost in passing, the way people mention things they assume everybody already knows, how kind it was of my granddaughter to help old Mr. Bellamy the way she had. I asked her what she meant, and I watched Carol's face shift slightly when she realized I genuinely did not know what she was talking about. The way a person's face shifts when they suddenly worry they have said something they were not supposed to say. She backpedaled a bit, said it was probably nothing, just something she had heard around the neighborhood, and I had to press her gently, the way you press a witness who is more loyal to discretion than to giving up information, before she finally told me that Emily had apparently been quietly making sure that Mr. Bellamy, an elderly widower 2 streets over, who lives alone on a fixed income that has not kept pace with the cost of, well, anything anymore, never went without groceries during the worst of this winter's price increases. Carol did not know the details. She only knew that more than once she had seen Emily come in, pay for a modest order, and have it delivered to Bellamy's door without ever putting her own name on the receipt or the note. I drove home that afternoon with my hands tighter on the steering wheel than the road required, my mind turning over what I had just learned the way a man turns over a stone he has found, looking for what is written on the other side of it. I have to stop here for a second, because this is the part of the story where everything I thought I understood about my own granddaughter started cracking open into something much bigger than I had imagined. Tell me, if you are still with me, where you are listening from right now, what city, what time the clock reads, where you are sitting. And tell me this too, since I am curious. Have you ever discovered that somebody you loved was carrying a weight you never even suspected, quietly, without asking for a single bit of credit for it? If that is you, leave a comment, because I read every single one of them, I promise you that. And if this story has its hand on your chest the way it has mine telling it, hit that like button and subscribe, because there is a new one of these waiting tomorrow, and they all carry something true inside them, same as this one does. Now let me keep going, because Mr. Bellamy was only the beginning of what I would come to learn. Over the following 2 weeks, I started paying very close attention to the rhythms of the South End neighborhood in a way I had not done since my root days, back when I knew every household on my path the way a farmer knows every furrow of his own field. I am embarrassed to admit how much of an old postal carrier's habits came roaring back to life during those weeks: the careful observation, the cataloging of small details, the patience to wait and watch rather than rush toward a conclusion that had not yet earned itself. I noticed Emily's car parked briefly outside the small brick duplex belonging to a widow named Dottie Fournier, a woman in her 80s who has lived alone since her husband passed nearly a decade ago, the kind of woman this neighborhood simply assumes will always be fine because she has always seemed fine, smiling and waving from her porch every single day of the year, regardless of what is actually happening behind her front door. I noticed a folded paper bag left discreetly on the back steps of another elderly neighbor's house, the Castonguay place, a married couple in their late 70s who, I happen to know, lost a significant portion of their retirement savings several years back due to a financial situation neither of them likes to discuss, and who have been quietly, proudly making do ever since, without ever once asking the neighborhood for help. I began to understand, piece by piece, the way a man assembles a picture from individual pieces of mail scattered across a sorting room floor, that my granddaughter had been doing something remarkable, and doing it in nearly total secrecy, for months. She had apparently noticed, in her quiet, observant way, the way she has noticed things since she was a child, sliding half a sandwich across a school lunch table, that several of the older residents in our stretch of the South End had begun quietly struggling, as the cost of nearly everything climbed faster than fixed incomes and modest pensions could keep pace with. Heating oil, groceries, prescription costs that seem to climb every single year regardless of what anybody in Washington promises. And rather than say anything to anyone, rather than organize some kind of visible community effort that might draw attention, and more importantly, might draw the kind of well-meaning pity that a proud older person often finds harder to bear than the hardship itself, Emily had apparently decided to handle it the way she has always handled everything that mattered to her. Quietly, personally, without asking for a single ounce of credit. What I still did not understand, even with all these pieces gathering in front of me, was the bag beneath her own bed, packed with food that, as far as I could tell, was never actually delivered anywhere. Simply kept there, organized, dated, waiting. That detail sat wrong with me, the way a single piece of a puzzle sits wrong when it almost fits, but not quite. And I found myself lying awake at night, turning it over and over, wondering what exactly my granddaughter was preparing for, and who, in the end, she believed she was protecting. I want to be honest with you about something here because honesty has carried me through 72 years on this earth better than nearly anything else has. As all of this began coming together in my mind, my fear did not lessen. If anything, it deepened into something new. Because a young woman quietly helping elderly neighbors with a few groceries here and there is one story, a good story, a story I would have been proud of immediately had I understood it from the start. But a young woman keeping a fully stocked emergency bag of food hidden beneath her own bed, dated and organized with the kind of precision that suggested long-term planning rather than a single act of kindness, told me there was something more underneath all of this that I still had not uncovered, some deeper worry driving her, some fear she had not spoken aloud to a single living soul, not even to me, the man who had loved her since the day she was born, the man who would have walked through fire for her without a second of hesitation if she had only told me where the fire was. I made the decision, lying awake that particular night with the radiators ticking their familiar song through the old pipes of this house, that I could not keep watching from a distance any longer. Whatever Emily was carrying, whatever weight had driven her to fill a bag with carefully dated supplies and hide it beneath her own bed like a soldier preparing for a siege nobody else could see coming, I needed to find a way to ask her directly, gently, the way you ask somebody you love a question you're terrified of the answer to. I want to pause one more time before I tell you what happened next, because I think this next part of the story is the part that changed something permanent in both of us. Tell me where you are tonight one more time, because it genuinely does help me to picture you out there, whoever and wherever you are. Leave a like if you have made it this far with me. Subscribe, because there is more coming, and what I learned sitting across from my granddaughter at our own kitchen table changed the way I think about generosity, about pride, about silence, and about love in ways I am still working through even now, telling you all of this. There is a new story here every single day, and I promise you, the truth waiting at the end of this one is not what either one of us expected walking into that conversation. Stay with me. We are not finished yet. I chose a Saturday morning for the conversation because Saturdays in this house have always carried a particular kind of stillness, the kind that gives a man room to say something difficult without the day rushing past him before he finds the courage to say it. Emily had no school, no early alarm pulling her out the door, and the snow from the week before had settled into that hard, bright crust that Vermont gets in December, the kind that makes the whole world look like it has been dipped in glass. I made breakfast the way Eleanor used to make it on weekends, eggs and the thick cut bacon from the butcher on St. Paul Street, coffee strong enough that Emily always teased me about it, and I set 2 plates down at the table instead of leaving mine on the counter the way I usually do when I eat alone. She came down in her robe with her hair still loose, rubbing her eyes the way she has done since she was a little girl spending summers in this house, and she sat down across from me and thanked me for breakfast the way she always does, with that same warmth that has never once wavered in all the years I have known her. I let her eat a few bites before I said anything. I am not a man who rushes into hard conversations. 40 years of standing on porches taught me that silence, held the right way, does more work than words ever can. I told her I needed to talk to her about something, and I watched her shoulders tighten just slightly, the way a person's shoulders tighten when some part of them has been waiting for this exact moment without knowing when it would arrive. I told her about the soup. I told her about the crackers. I told her, as gently as I knew how, about the night of the snowstorm and the light beneath her door and what I had found beneath her bed the next morning while she was at work. I watched her face go through several things at once, surprise, then something close to embarrassment, then a kind of resignation that broke my heart more than anger would have, because anger I could have met head on, but resignation in a 27-year-old woman is a thing no grandfather wants to witness across his own breakfast table. She set her fork down very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands have suddenly become unreliable, and she was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I almost told her she did not have to explain anything at all, that I would let it go if it was too hard to say. But then she started talking, and once she started, it seemed like something in her had been waiting a very long time for somebody to finally ask. She told me about Mr. Bellamy first, the way he had mentioned to her, almost as a joke, that he had taken to having soup for both lunch and supper some weeks because the price of nearly everything else had gotten away from his pension, and how he had laughed when he said it, the kind of laugh a proud man uses to cover something that is not funny at all. She told me about Dottie Fournier, who Emily had noticed walking the same 3 blocks to the smaller market on Pine Street instead of driving to the larger grocery store across town, and when Emily had asked her about it one afternoon, helping her carry a single light bag of groceries up her icy front steps, Dottie had admitted quietly that gas had gotten too expensive to justify the trip for what little she could afford to buy anyway. She told me about the Castengais, about overhearing, entirely by accident, a conversation between them on their own back porch about whether they could afford to keep their heat at 68 degrees through January or whether they would need to drop it lower, and how it had stayed with her for days afterward, the particular quiet shame in the husband's voice as he said it. Let me pause for just a moment here, because I think what Emily told me next is something a lot of you listening already understand in your bones. Even if you have never had reason to put words to it before, tell me down in the comments where you are listening from tonight, what town, what corner of this country you call home, and what time your clock reads right now. And tell me this too. Have you ever noticed an older person in your own life quietly making do with less, smiling through it, never once asking for help, even when help was sitting right there for the taking? If that is you, leave that comment, because I promise you I read every single one. Leave a like if this story has its hand around your chest the way it has mine telling it to you. Subscribe, because there is a new one of these waiting for you tomorrow, and I have got a feeling that some of you out there need exactly what is coming next. All right, let me get back to my granddaughter, sitting across from me at that kitchen table, finally telling me the truth. Emily told me that she had started small, almost without deciding to, the way good things sometimes happen before a person has fully thought them through. A few extra cans in her own cart at the store, dropped off quietly on a porch with no note. A grocery delivery paid for anonymously through the market, with Carol's help keeping her name off the receipt. It had not been a plan at first, she told me. It had been an instinct, the same instinct that made her slide half a sandwich across a lunch table when she was 7 years old, except now she was 27, and the instinct had grown up alongside her into something with a much larger reach than a single sandwich. But as the winter deepened and the cost of everything kept climbing the way it has this year, faster than wages, faster than pensions, faster than anybody in this state seems able to keep up with, Emily told me she had started worrying about what would happen if something sudden hit one of these neighbors all at once. A broken furnace in the dead of January, an unexpected medical bill, a car repair that could not wait. She knew from her own modest librarian's salary that she did not have deep pockets to draw from in an emergency. And so she had begun quietly assembling that bag beneath her bed, not for herself, but as a kind of reserve, something she could grab at a moment's notice if she heard that one of her neighbors had been hit by exactly the kind of sudden hardship that does not wait politely for payday. I asked her, my voice not quite steady, why she had never told me. Why she had never told her own mother. Why she had carried all of this entirely alone, in total secrecy, for months. She looked at me then with an expression I will carry with me for the rest of my life, somewhere between love and exhaustion, and she told me something that has stayed lodged in my chest ever since, turning over and over like a stone in a creek bed. She said that if people knew, it would stop being help and start being charity, and there is a difference, Grandpa, a real difference. And these are proud people. People who have worked their whole lives and built families and paid their taxes and never once asked anybody for a handout. And the moment they realized the neighborhood was watching them, was talking about them, was pitying them, something in them would break that no amount of canned soup could ever fix. She said she would rather carry the weight of it quietly than be the reason somebody felt ashamed for needing a little help getting through a hard winter. I sat there across from my granddaughter in the gray December light coming through the kitchen window, and I felt something shift inside my own chest, the way ice shifts on the lake in early spring, cracking loose from something it had been frozen to for a very long time. Because I understood sitting there that I had spent weeks assuming the worst, building a story in my head about secrets and danger and something dark hiding beneath my own roof, when the truth had been so much simpler and so much more beautiful than anything my worried imagination had constructed. My granddaughter was not hiding a wound. She was hiding a gift, and hiding it specifically because she understood something about pride and dignity that most people 3 times her age never fully learn. I want to tell you something honest here because I think it matters. I felt ashamed of myself in that moment, sitting at that table, not because I had been wrong to worry. A grandfather worrying about a granddaughter who is not eating right is never wrong to worry. That worry comes from love, and love does not apologize for itself. But I felt ashamed because some small part of me, walking into that conversation, had been braced for something I needed to fix, some problem only I could solve, the way a man of my generation is taught to believe that love means fixing things. And instead, I found a young woman who had already figured out how to give, fully and completely, without needing me or anybody else to fix a single thing about it. She had not needed rescuing. She had been doing the rescuing herself, quietly for months, while I slept soundly 2 doors down the hall, none the wiser. We sat there for a long while after that, the coffee going cold in our cups, the kind of silence that is not empty but full of everything that had just shifted between us. I reached across the table at one point and took her hand, the way I used to take Eleanor's hand during the hard years, and I told Emily that I was proud of her in a way I did not have adequate words for, and that I needed her to understand something important, which is that what she had been doing was not a burden she needed to carry alone any longer, not because I was going to take it away from her, but because some weights get lighter the moment they are shared, even if the sharing only means somebody else knows you're carrying it. I have to stop here for a moment, because what came next in this story is the part that taught me something about my own pride that I had never once examined in 72 years of living. If you are still with me, tell me where you are listening from. and what time it is where you're sitting right now. Leave a like if this story is landing somewhere true in you. And subscribe, because there's more here, and what happened over the following weeks changed not just how I saw my granddaughter, but how I saw myself, this house, and this whole neighborhood I thought I already knew everything about after 72 years of living in it. There's a new story waiting for you tomorrow, same time, same place, and I promise it will carry something worth sitting with. Now let me tell you what happened next. Once Emily and I had that conversation, something in our household changed in a way I had not expected. I had assumed, foolishly, that simply knowing the truth would settle things, that Emily would feel relieved to have shared her secret, and that life would carry on more or less the way it had before, except now with one less thing hidden between us. But love, real love, the kind that survives 40 years of marriage and the raising of children and the long, slow work of growing old, rarely settles for simply knowing. It wants to participate. It wants to help carry. And I found myself, in the days that followed, unable to sit quietly with what I had learned. I started in my own clumsy way, trying to get involved, and I will tell you honestly that my first attempts were not graceful. I offered Emily money outright one evening, sliding an envelope across the table the way I might have settled a bill, and I watched her face close slightly, and that same proud resistance rising in her that I now understood came from the very same place that drove her to help the neighbors in the first place. She told me, kindly but firmly, that this was not about money, not really, that money could fix a single emergency, but it could not fix the deeper problem, which was that an entire generation of proud, hard-working people in this neighborhood had been taught their whole lives that needing help was a kind of failure, and that no amount of cash slipped quietly under a door was going to undo decades of that particular lesson. I sat with that for a long while after she said it, turning it over the way I turn over most things these days, slowly, the way an old man chews on an idea that is bigger than the bite he originally meant to take. And I began to think about my own father, a man who worked the rail yards here in Burlington for 35 years before his back finally gave out on him, a man who would rather have gone hungry than let a neighbor see him accept a basket of charity on his porch. I thought about how that same pride had been passed down to me, quietly, the way pride always travels through families, unspoken but unmistakable, and how I myself had spent years after Eleanor passed refusing offers of casseroles and company from neighbors who meant well, because some old, stubborn part of me believed that accepting help meant admitting I could not manage my own grief alone. I remember the time, not long after Eleanor's funeral, when our neighbor, Mrs. Abernathy, brought over a chicken pot pie still warm from her own oven, and I thanked her at the door and told her I was managing just fine, and then I put that pie in the refrigerator and let it sit there for 4 days before I finally ate it alone at midnight, ashamed of my own hunger and my own grief in equal measure, as if needing comfort was itself a kind of weakness a man my age should have already outgrown. I had never told anybody that story before, not even Patricia. But I told Emily that morning, sitting at our kitchen table with the December light slanting low and gold across the wood, and I watched something soften in her face as I said it, the particular softening that happens when two people realize they have been carrying the very same stone, just in different pockets. That conversation became, in its own quiet way, the real turning point of everything that followed. Because Emily and I began, slowly, carefully, to think together about how to help these neighbors in a way that honored their pride instead of wounding it. It is one thing for a young woman to quietly carry a few groceries to a porch in the dark. It is another thing entirely to build something that could last, something that could reach further than one bag of canned soup at a time, without ever once making a single soul feel like they were standing in a charity line with their hand out. We started talking, in the evenings after supper, about Eleanor's old pantry, the small back room off the kitchen that my wife had used for decades to store her canning, her preserves, the dozens of jars of tomato sauce and pickled beans she put up every single autumn for 38 years of our marriage. That room had sat mostly empty since she passed, a kind of museum to a version of this house that no longer quite existed, and I had not been able to bring myself to clear it out, the way a man cannot bring himself to throw away the last things that still smell like the person he lost. I want to pause here, because I think this next part is where the real heart of this story begins to show itself, and I would be doing you a disservice if I rushed through it. Tell me, one more time, where you are listening from tonight, and how late it has gotten where you are sitting. If somebody you love has ever taught you something about pride that you did not expect to learn, leave that in the comments, because I would like to hear it. Leave a like if this is reaching you the way it reached me living it. And subscribe, because there is a new story here every single day. And the next chapter of this one is going to show you something that, honestly, I am still a little amazed we managed to pull off in this old house. Stay with me. We have not gotten to the best part yet. The idea came to me, strangely enough, while I was standing in Eleanor's old pantry, late one evening in the middle of January, running my hand along the empty shelf where her canning jars used to sit, lined up like a row of small glass soldiers. I'd gone in there looking for nothing in particular, the way an old man sometimes wanders into a room just to be near a memory for a few minutes. and I found myself thinking about how this small, forgotten space in the back of my kitchen had once been the beating heart of this entire household, feeding not just our own family, but half the street during hard winters, when Eleanor would send me out with extra jars for neighbors who never quite had enough put up of their own. It struck me, standing there in the cold quiet of that little room, that the answer to the problem Emily and I had been turning over for weeks had been sitting right here the entire time, gathering dust, waiting for somebody to remember what it was built for in the first place. I brought the idea to Emily that same night, half-formed and clumsy the way most of my ideas tend to be before she gets her hands on them and makes them actually workable. What if, I asked her, we turned Eleanor's old pantry into something the whole neighborhood could use? Not a charity drive, with names and forms and the kind of paperwork that makes a proud person feel like they are confessing a failure, but something quieter than that, something with no names attached at all. A shelf where anybody could leave what they had extra of, and anybody could take what they needed, with nobody keeping score, nobody writing anything down, nobody standing at the door deciding who deserved what. Emily was quiet for a long moment after I said it, and I watched her turn the idea over the same careful way she turns over every decision in her life, weighing it from every angle before she commits to it. And then she smiled. That same warm smile her mother has, the one that has been passed down through 3 generations of women in this family now, and she told me it was the best idea I had ever had. And she said it in a way that made me feel, for just a moment, like a young man again, the kind of feeling I had not had in years. We spent the better part of that next week clearing out the old pantry, and I will tell you honestly that it was harder than I expected, not the physical work. My knee complained plenty, but my arms still work fine. It was the emotional weight of touching each of Eleanor's old jars and tools and handwritten labels, the particular ache of moving through a space that still belonged, in some essential way, to a woman who had been gone 4 years but whose handwriting still labeled half the shelves in faded blue ink. Emily was patient with me through all of it, letting me hold each jar a little longer than necessary before deciding whether to keep it or pass it along, never once rushing me. The same patience she'd clearly been extending to an entire neighborhood of proud elderly people without any of us realizing it. We built simple wooden shelves along one wall, the kind I could still manage with my own 2 hands despite my age, and we set up a small table near the back door. The one that opens onto the side yard facing the quiet residential street, easy enough for anybody to slip up to without being seen from the main road. We stocked it ourselves at first, the 2 of us, with shelf-stable goods, canned vegetables and soups, pasta and rice, peanut butter, the kind of staples that keep well through a Vermont winter and stretch a tight budget further than most people realize. We left no sign, no announcement, nothing that called attention to what the little room had become. We simply left the side door unlocked during daylight hours, and we waited. Let me stop here for just a moment, because I want to know something from all of you listening. Tell me down in the comments where you are tonight, what town, what time the clock reads, where you are sitting right now. And tell me this too, because I am genuinely curious. Do you have a place like this in your own town, a quiet shelf, a hidden cupboard, a corner of a church basement where folks can take what they need without anybody keeping track of who took what? If you do, I would love to hear about it. Leave that, if this story is starting to feel like something warm in your chest the way it has felt in mine telling it to you, subscribe, because there's more coming, and I promise you what happened after we opened that door is something I think about every single day since. There is a new story waiting for you tomorrow, and I have got a feeling some of you are going to want to come back for it. Now let me tell you what happened. The first few days, nothing happened at all, and I will admit, I started to worry that the idea, as good as it had felt sitting at our kitchen table dreaming it up, simply was not going to work the way we hoped. Proud people, I reminded myself, do not change their habits overnight, just because a door has been left unlocked. But on the 5th day, I noticed that 2 cans of soup had gone missing from the shelf, and in their place sat a small jar of homemade strawberry preserves I did not recognize, the kind of quiet, dignified trade that told me everything I needed to know without a single word being spoken. Somebody had taken what they needed, and rather than feel like they had accepted charity, they had left something of their own behind, the way neighbors have traded with each other in small towns since long before either Emily or I were born. Over the following weeks, that little room off the kitchen developed its own quiet rhythm, the kind of rhythm a place takes on when it starts serving the purpose it was always meant to serve. Cans would disappear, and new ones would appear. A bag of flour would vanish, and a dozen eggs would show up the next day from somebody's own backyard chickens. Once, I found a beautiful hand-knitted scarf folded neatly on the shelf with no note attached, left, I have to assume, by somebody grateful enough to want to give something back, even though they had no idea who exactly to thank. We never asked who was taking what, and we never asked who was leaving what either. That, I came to understand, was the entire point. I remember one particular afternoon in late January when I happened to be out in the side yard shoveling the walk. a chore I still insist on doing myself, despite my children's repeated suggestions that I hire it out. And I saw Mr. Bellamy himself walking up the side path toward that little door, moving slower than he used to, leaning a bit more on his cane than he had the year before. He did not see me at first, tucked as I was behind the hedge with my shovel, and I watched him glance around the way a proud man glances around before doing something he's not entirely sure he once witnessed. And then he slipped through the door and emerged a few minutes later with a small paper sack tucked under his arm, his shoulders just slightly less burdened than they had been walking in. I did not say a word to him. I simply nodded as he passed, the way two old men nod to each other on a winter afternoon when there is nothing that needs saying, and he nodded back, and that was the whole of it. But I stood there in the cold for a long while after he had gone, leaning on my shovel, feeling something in my chest that I had not felt in a very long time, a kind of quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with purpose. I want to pause here, because I think this is worth saying plainly. For 4 years after Eleanor passed, I had been a man going through the motions of a life, getting up, making coffee, walking to the market, coming home to an empty house that echoed more than it ever used to. I had purpose once, 40 years of it, delivering mail up and down these same streets, knowing I was needed, knowing somebody was waiting on whatever I carried in my bag each morning. Retirement had taken that away from me, slowly, the way age takes most things away from a man slowly, and I had not realized, until that afternoon, standing in the cold, watching Mr. Bellamy walk back down the path with his small paper sack, how much I had been missing exactly that feeling, needed, useful, part of something larger than my own quiet rooms. Emily gave me that back without ever meaning to, simply by letting me in on the secret she had been carrying alone. I have to stop here for a moment, because what comes next in this story involves the rest of the family. And I want to tell you honestly that not everybody understood right away what Emily and I had built in that little pantry. And not every reaction was the warm one I'm sure you're hoping for. Tell me where you are listening from one more time, because I am curious how far this story has traveled by now. Leave a like if you're still with me, and subscribe if you have not already, because the next part of this gets a little more complicated before it gets all the way to where it needs to go. There is a new story here every single day, and I think tomorrow's might be exactly what somebody out there listening tonight needs to hear. Now, let me tell you about the evening my daughter Patricia found out what we had done, because that conversation did not go quite the way either Emily or I expected. Patricia came by on a Thursday evening in early February, unannounced, the way she sometimes does when she has had a long day at the school where she teaches, and just wants the comfort of her childhood kitchen for an hour before heading home to her own. She let herself in the side door, the way she has done since she was a girl, and she walked straight through what used to be Eleanor's pantry without even realizing at first that anything had changed, until she noticed the new shelving, the neatly stacked cans, the small handwritten sign Emily had made that simply read, "Take what you need, leave what you can, no questions asked." Patricia stood there for a long moment, looking at that little room, and when she turned to find Emily and me in the kitchen, I could see immediately that her face carried more worry than warmth. She asked us, carefully, whether we understood what we had done, whether we understood the liability involved in leaving a door unlocked for strangers to wander through, whether we had thought through what might happen if somebody took advantage of an old man's house standing open on a quiet residential street. I understood, hearing her say it, that her worry came from the exact same place mine had come from weeks earlier, watching her own daughter, the same instinct to protect that runs through every generation of this family, whether we want it to or not. But I will admit, it stung a little, hearing caution where I had hoped for pride. Emily, to her credit, did not get defensive the way a younger version of herself might have. She sat her mother down at the table, the same table where I had first heard the truth myself, and she explained everything patiently, the same way she had explained it to me, about Mr. Bellamy and Dottie Fournier and the Castongays, about pride and dignity and the particular kind of help that does not feel like help at all because nobody is watching to keep score. And I watched something in Patricia soften as her daughter spoke, the same softening I had felt myself weeks before, the recognition of a truth too good and too simple to argue against once you actually understood it. By the time Emily finished talking, Patricia had tears standing in her eyes, and she reached across the table and took her daughter's hand the same way I had taken it weeks before, and she said something I will never forget, something about how she had spent so many years worrying about whether she had raised Emily right, whether she had given her enough, taught her enough, and sitting there in that kitchen she finally understood that somewhere along the way, without any of us quite noticing it happen, Emily had grown into exactly the kind of person this family had always hoped she would become, the kind of person Eleanor herself would have been prouder of than words could properly carry. I want to leave you here for now, because there is more to this story still to come, more about how this little pantry grew beyond anything Emily or I could have imagined on our own, more about the neighbors who eventually found their own quiet ways to give back, and more about what all of this came to mean, in the end, for a tired old man and his remarkable granddaughter living together in a house that had finally, after 4 long years, found its heartbeat again. Tell me one more time where you're listening from tonight, and leave that like if this story has settled somewhere warm in your chest. Subscribe, because we are not finished yet, not even close, and I promise you the rest of what happened is worth every minute you spend staying with me for it. Several months passed after that evening at the kitchen table, and I want to tell you that spring came to Burlington the way it always does, slowly, reluctantly, with the lake taking its time to let go of the gray it wears all winter. And somewhere in the middle of that thaw, the little pantry off my kitchen had become something neither Emily nor I had quite planned for. Though looking back now, I think some part of both of us had hoped for exactly this without daring to say it out loud. It had become a living thing, the way a garden becomes a living thing once you stop trying to control every single inch of it and simply let it grow the way it wants to grow. By March, the shelves that Emily and I had built with our own hands were rarely empty for more than a day or two at a time, because the neighborhood had started on its own without a single flyer or announcement or organized meeting to understand what that little room was for and to participate in keeping it alive. Carol from the market began setting aside items that were close to their date but still perfectly good, the kind of thing a smaller grocery often has to discount or discard, and she would quietly drop them by on her way home some evenings, rather than let them go to waste. The Castangays, who I told you had been quietly struggling themselves through the worst of the winter, surprised me one afternoon by showing up with a flat of tomato seedlings from their own greenhouse, insisting that come summer the pantry ought to have fresh vegetables too, not just canned goods, and watching that proud, careful couple find their own way to give back, after months of quietly receiving, was one of the gentlest things I have ever witnessed in 72 years of living in this town. Let me pause here for a moment, because I think this next part deserves your full attention. And I want to thank you, genuinely, for staying with me this far into the story. Tell me down in the comments where you are listening from tonight, what town, what state, and what time the clock reads where you are sitting right now, because I have loved hearing from so many of you already. And I read every single word you leave me. If this story has done something for you tonight, leave that like, because it tells me to keep telling these, and there is a new one waiting every single day. And if you know somebody who might need to hear a story like this one, somebody who has ever given quietly without asking for thanks, or somebody who has ever worried about a person they love the way I worried about Emily, share this with them, because sometimes the right story finds the right person at exactly the moment they need it most. Now, let me finish telling you how this all came together. Dottie Fournier, the widow 2 streets over, who Emily had first noticed walking those extra blocks to save on gas, became, in her own quiet way, something like the unofficial caretaker of that little pantry as the months went on. She started stopping by most mornings, not to take anything for herself any longer, since her situation had eased somewhat once her daughter in Montreal began sending a little extra each month after learning what her mother had been doing without, but simply to straighten the shelves, to check the dates on the cans the way Emily always had, to make sure everything stayed organized and dignified rather than letting the rooms slip into the kind of clutter that can make even the kindest gesture start to feel like charity rather than care. I would see her out there some mornings through my kitchen window, an 80-something-year-old woman in her wool coat, humming to herself while she worked. And I came to understand that she had found something in that little room that she had been missing since her husband passed. The same thing I had found in it myself. Purpose. A reason to put her coat on and walk out the door each morning. I think it is worth pausing here to tell you something about my own transformation through all of this, because I went into this story as a worried old man convinced something was wrong inside his own house, and I came out the other side of it having learned something about myself that I'm not sure I would have learned any other way. I had spent 4 years since Eleanor passed believing, quietly, that my purpose in this world had mostly come to an end. I had delivered the mail for nearly 40 years. I had raised a daughter who turned out remarkable. I had loved a woman fiercely for most of my adult life. And once Eleanor was gone, I had let myself believe, without ever quite admitting it out loud, that the meaningful chapters of my life were behind me, and that what remained was simply the slow, quiet work of waiting. Emily taught me, without ever intending to teach me anything at all, that this was not true, and it was never true. Not for her, and not for me, and probably not for most people who believe it about themselves somewhere along the way. Purpose does not retire the way a postal carrier retires. It simply waits for you to notice where it has been hiding the whole time, sometimes right beneath your own bed, sometimes in the back room of your own kitchen, sometimes in the quiet courage of a 27-year-old woman who decided that her grandmother's empty pantry deserved a second life. I have to stop here for a moment because I want to know something honest from all of you. Have you ever believed your own best chapters were behind you, only to discover that was not true at all? If that is you tonight, tell me about it in the comments, because I think there are more of us out there than any of us realize, sitting in our own quiet kitchens, wondering if our usefulness has run out. Leave a like if that question landed somewhere true in you. Subscribe if you have not already, because there is a new story here every single day. And some of them, like this one, are not really about the hardship at all. They are about what comes after it, which I have come to believe matters even more. Now, let me tell you what happened with Patricia, because her own journey through all of this is worth telling properly. In the weeks following that Thursday evening when she first learned what Emily and I had built, Patricia became, somewhat to her own surprise, one of the pantry's most devoted supporters. I think something in her had needed, for longer than any of us realized, a way to feel useful to her own community beyond the walls of her classroom. And once she understood that this little room was not a liability, the way her first instinct had warned her it might be, but rather a quiet, dignified gift that asked nothing of anyone, she threw herself into it with the same warmth she has carried her whole life. She started a small, informal habit of stopping by the market on her way home from school each Friday, picking up whatever was on sale that week, peanut butter, canned vegetables, the staples that stretched furthest, and dropping them off at the pantry before heading to her own house, never telling a single soul outside our family that she was doing it. I asked her once, sitting at my kitchen table on one of those Friday evenings, what had changed her mind so completely from that first worried conversation, and she told me something that has stayed with me ever since. She said that watching her own daughter quietly carry the weight of an entire neighborhood, without asking for credit, without needing anybody to know, had made her ashamed of how much energy she had spent over the years worrying about appearances, about what the neighbors might think, about doing things the proper, visible, socially acceptable way. She said Emily had shown her, without a single lecture, that the quietest forms of love are very often the most powerful ones, and that a person does not need an audience to do something that matters. I want to take a moment here, because I think this is one of the most important parts of the whole story, and I do not want to rush through it. Tell me where you are listening from one more time, and what hour it is wherever you're sitting tonight, because I have a particular fondness for imagining all of you scattered across this country, in kitchens and trucks and quiet bedrooms, listening to an old man tell you about his granddaughter. Leave that, like if you have made it this far with me, and subscribe, because we are nearly at the end of this one, but there is so much more waiting for you tomorrow, and the day after that, because there is a new story here every single day, and I have got a feeling some of you are going to want to stay for all of them. Now, let me tell you about this spring evening that, in many ways, brought this whole story full circle. It was a Sunday in late April, the kind of evening Vermont only gives you a handful of each year, warm enough finally to leave the windows cracked, the smell of somebody's neighbor grilling drifting faintly down the street, the lake finally free of ice and glinting gold with the last of the daylight. I had made supper the way I always do on Sundays, pot roast again, the same recipe Eleanor taught me decades ago, and Emily came down from upstairs in the easy, unguarded way she has had ever since that December morning, when the truth finally came out between us. No more careful watching of her own plate, no more quiet calculations about how much she could afford to eat before there would not be enough left to give away. She sat down across from me at the table, the same table her great-grandfather built, the same table where I had first learned months earlier exactly what kind of woman my granddaughter had grown into, and she ate every single bite on her plate that evening, all of it without a single moment of the careful, deliberate restraint I had spent weeks worrying over back in December. I watched her finish and reach for a second helping and laugh at something silly I said about my knee, complaining about the weather change, and I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for months, the particular peace that comes when you finally watch somebody you love put their own plate first, not because the world has become perfect, not because every struggling neighbor in the South End has suddenly found their footing, but because she finally understood in her bones that she did not have to carry every single burden in this neighborhood entirely alone, on her own back, in total secrecy, in order for her love to count. I want to tell you something about what I have learned through all of this, because I think it matters more than the specific details of cans and pantries and proud elderly neighbors, even though I have loved telling you every single one of those details. I learned that the people who give the most quietly are very often the ones we worry about the least, simply because their giving does not announce itself the way other things in life tend to announce themselves. I spent weeks convinced something was wrong inside my own house when, in fact, something was deeply, beautifully right, hidden so carefully that I nearly missed it entirely. I think about that often now, the way worry can sometimes blind a man to the very thing he should be proudest of. And I think it is worth saying plainly to anybody listening tonight who has ever worried about somebody they love behaving strangely, that sometimes strange behavior is not a wound at all. Sometimes it is a kindness so large the person carrying it does not yet know how to let anybody else see it. I think it is also worth saying something to anybody listening who has ever been the one doing the quiet giving, the one skipping their own coffee so somebody else's lights stay on, the one who has learned, the way Emily learned, that real generosity rarely wants an audience. You're not required to carry every weight alone in order for your kindness to be real. Asking for a little help, letting somebody else in on what you are carrying, does not diminish what you have given. If anything, I have come to believe it multiplies it. Because love shared between more than one set of hands tends to grow rather than shrink. The same way that little pantry off my kitchen grew once more than just Emily and I were tending it. I want to pause here because I'm getting close to the end of what I came here to tell you, and I want to make sure I say this part the right way. Tell me, one final time, where you're listening from tonight, what town, what state, and what the clock says, where you're sitting right now, because it has meant more to me than you probably realize, knowing that all of you have been out there listening to an old man talk about his granddaughter in a pantry full of canned soup. If this story has settled somewhere warm in your chest the way it has settled in mine telling it, leave that like. And leave me a comment, because I genuinely do read every single one. And I would love to know which part of this story stayed with you the longest. Subscribe if you have not already, because there is a new story waiting for you tomorrow. And the day after that, every single day without fail. And I promise you, each one carries something true inside it the same way this one has. And if you know somebody who needs to hear this tonight, somebody who has ever quietly carried more than their fair share, or somebody who has ever worried over a loved one the way I worried over Emily, send this their way. Because you never know exactly when the right story is going to land on the right heart at the right moment. As for that little pantry, it is still there today, tucked into what used to be Eleanor's canning room, the shelves still filling and emptying in that same quiet rhythm we first noticed back in January. No names attached, no questions asked, no record kept of who gives and who takes, because in the end, I came to understand those two things are very often the same people anyway, simply on different weeks of their lives. Mr. Bellamy still walks up that side path some mornings, a little slower now than he was last winter, but steadier, in a way I think has as much to do with feeling cared for as it does with anything medical. Dottie Fournier still straightens those shelves most mornings, humming to herself the way she always does. And Emily, my remarkable granddaughter, still lives here in this old Victorian house in the South End, her own farmhouse finally finished and waiting for her whenever she decides she is ready, though I will admit, selfishly, that some part of me hopes she takes her time deciding. I think about the bread that started all of this, that simple, ordinary loaf disappearing faster than it should have, and I smile now, thinking back on how frightened I was that morning, how certain I was that something terrible was hiding inside my own home. The bread was never a mystery to be solved, not really. It was a clue pointing toward something far better than anything my worried imagination had built. It was evidence of a young woman so full of love for people she barely knew that she was willing to go a little hungry herself rather than let a single neighbor go without. I do not think I will ever look at an empty bread bag the same way again, and I find, strangely, that I am grateful for that. Grateful that something so small taught me something so large about the woman my granddaughter has become. If there is one thing I would ask you to carry away from this story tonight, it is simply this. Pay attention to the quiet ones in your own life, the ones who give without announcing it, the ones whose small, careful habits might be hiding something far more beautiful than anything you have imagined. And if you yourself are one of the quiet ones, carrying something heavy on behalf of somebody else without ever asking for thanks, know that it is not weakness to let somebody else in on what you are carrying. Sometimes the bravest thing a generous heart can do is finally let itself be seen the way Emily finally let herself be seen at our own kitchen table on an ordinary December morning, and the way this whole neighborhood found itself a little kinder, a little more connected, simply because one young woman decided that nobody around her deserved to go hungry in silence. If you stayed with me through every part of this, then you have given an old man something I do not quite have the right words for, and I am grateful for it more than I can properly say. So let me ask you one last thing tonight. If you really listened, if you really stayed for the whole of the story, leave me a comment with one single word. And that word is quiet, because only the people who stayed all the way through will understand exactly why that word matters to me. Leave us like if this story is one you will carry with you a little while. Subscribe, because there is a new story here every single day, without fail. And maybe tomorrow's is the one that finds you exactly when you need it, or find somebody you love at the exact moment they need it most. Share this with anybody who has ever quietly given more than their fair share, or anybody who has ever worried over somebody they love without knowing quite how to ask the right question. From me to you, thank you for sitting with an old man and his granddaughter for a little while tonight. Take care of each other out there. And keep an eye on the quiet ones, because they are very often carrying more than any of us realize.